Mhm. Hello, everyone. Matthew Kabitas here, as always, here on Cubic Dimensions. If you're a late viewer, probably like most people, just kind of a last-minute thing Christian and I decided because he will not be here next Sunday. But this is my first broadcast from my college dorm, so that's exciting. That flag actually is not mine. That is my roommate's. Most of my stuff is over this way and on my desk, so you can't really see it. And, from now on, I guess when I'm doing shows here, he may come in from time to time, who knows. But he's promised to try to be as least destructive as possible. And usually, most of the time, when he comes to the dorm, he just kind of sits in his bed or on his laptop, so he doesn't tend to be disruptive usually. Anyway, so Christian, say hi.
Hello, Internet. I used to say that before when I ran a show, but I don't run a show anymore. That will change. That's going to change soon. But anyways, all besides the point. Hello, Internet. How are you doing? Fine weather we're having. I'm serious. At work, we had that someone decided to put the Toronto news on. I don't know why, because we're not in Toronto. But literally, their top story of the day was good weather for final day of August. I'm like, why is this your top story? There's so much going on.
Well done.
Anyway.
Well done.
Yeah. Toronto.
That's Canada for you. There's so little going on, they have to talk about the weather like it's an actual issue.
Yeah, pretty much. And good weather at that. Not even bad, just good weather. Oh, man.
All right.
Anyway.
So let's get to our first story. Christian was kind of in charge of that because I have obviously been busy the last week or so, moving into college and wrapping my things up. So he will be introducing many of the topics, including this first one. So go ahead.
Let's go on into the void. So the big one I wanted to talk about, not the big one, a story I did want to talk about, though, was... Actually, it's sort of weird. I feel like a lot of my stories kind of tied together in a weird way in the end. We'll see if I come back to that line of thinking I had when I found them. But basically, in France, we know about the burkini ban. And basically, in the span between our last show and now, the ban was put in place, enforced, and then overturned by France's highest court. Like, that's what happens when we don't do a show for a week. Entire laws come and go. So for those of you who don't know what a burkini basically is it's basically a wetsuit that Muslim women would wear to a beach, but in effect it's a wetsuit. And anyways, it was basically it was designed by a Muslim woman in France who felt, basically in her opinion, that in the for those of you who don't know, in the Muslim religion, very conservative Muslims don't allow women to go to the beach. So for her, in her opinion, that was a way to get Muslim women to go to the beach. So ironically, she made this burkini, which was made as like a symbol of like progressive Islam, was banned by French people who were afraid of radical conservative Muslims that they were all fighting against in the first place. So yeah, I don't know if you want to give an opinion on it before I keep rambling.
Well, I just wanted to say we kind of touched on this kind of sort of in my philosophy class, which I had the first of yesterday. So I'm already really well versed in philosophy. No, I'm kidding. I took one class. I know Freud.
I know Freud.
No, okay, but this is something we kind of touched on in terms of how European countries versus the United States have integrated immigrants. In the case that we were talking about, Syrian refugees, but in general, the history of integrating immigrants into the country and assimilating them. while the U.S. hasn't had the best history in what would be ideal for immigrant assimilation, arguably we've had a better history than Europe has. And this can be seen today in modern Europe by, for instance, in France, with the so-called banlieues, which are basically a ring around different major cities that are typically the more, quote, sketchy part of town, or the projects, if you will, and they're mainly filled with immigrants, especially Muslim and Arab immigrants. So already, before we even get this discussion going about the more specific burkini ban, we're already dealing with the context of a country that, while tends to be more progressive than the United States on many issues, in terms of immigrants and other cultures, hasn't really done a great job of that, whether it's in the past or today.
Yep. Actually, so that's an interesting note to get on to the next thing. It's sort of so as you know, Matt gets a lot of stories from The Hill. That's his favorite website, news place to go. My favorite one's Foreign Policy. And they sort of had a few articles on foreign policy over the last month where they've sort of been discussing this concept of illiberal democracy versus liberal kind of oligarchy. And they were saying how the guy was sort of talking about that in the context of the burkini ban, but they've had other stories talking about it more generally. And he was saying what you've had happen here now is, in France, generally, their Supreme Court doesn't do anything. Like in Canada and the US, we expect the Supreme Court to be very active in ensuring the government doesn't do things that are unconstitutional, whereas in France, generally, the Supreme Court will always find a way to justify whatever the popular will was. And this was a very rare case of them not doing that. And they're sort of saying this is sort of a battle that is going to unfold over the course of the next few decades and perhaps longer. Because you see, you see a lot of, her hair was just hilarious, I'm sorry. So you see this battle between a large portion of the population who believes that this minority should not be given equal rights. I think you see it a lot in the US and on some small scale in Canada as well, where you have this portion of the population who doesn't care about minorities and all that and feels that they should be allowed to pass laws that discriminate against these minorities, against a more landed establishment who understand that you shouldn't do that and are willing to go against the popular will and sort of institutionalize mechanisms to stop the popular will from hurting minorities. And you sort of end up with this battle between these people who believe in this, it's sort of this tyranny of the majority versus the defense of the minority by a sort of landed elite, which I don't think there's a nice, convenient term for. But I found that an interesting kind of way to summarize that battle, and I just want to know what your opinion is on that.
So, okay, so, sorry, could you clear that up for just a second? Like, what exactly your
I'm sorry, because I'm not, this is why I need to do videos more, because I'm losing my ability to summarize things quickly and conveniently. In a nutshell, you have a case, we'll use Jeff Burkini example, I think it'll be clearer that way. You have a case where popular opinion is in France, both on the left and the right, that there should be a burkini ban. But the Supreme Court and, you know, members of the government have basically said, look, our Constitution says they're allowed to wear whatever the heck they want. These regulations that want these illiberal laws, perhaps a majority, but there is in the government an understanding that these laws shouldn't be passed and a willingness to weaken the democracy in the name of protecting the minority. Does that make sense?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry. You kind of like broke up there for a little bit. I don't know if that was my end or your end, but just wasn't receiving you too much. So, but anyway, yeah, this is in the I guess you could probably equate this to in the United States, Brown v. Board of Education, because the popular sentiment at the time was that schools should be segregated, and those black schools should be have lower quality than white schools inherently, because schools are funded by property taxes, and obviously black people tended at that time to be much poorer and therefore couldn't pay as much in property taxes, therefore not enough money went to their schools, therefore their schools were bad. So this is kind of like that, in where the Supreme Court, despite what the majority of the country believed, said no, separate but equal is not equal. You know, and so on and so forth, that kind of thing. Similar to when also when the I believe it was the Army and the National Guard were used to in Little Rock, Arkansas, by President Eisenhower, and at Ole Miss in Mississippi by JFK. And while this is a short-term victory, the long-term victory I'm looking for is educating the French people and educating people overall on this stuff. Because, at least from the left perspective, in France, they're probably most likely not coming from a place of malice. I know because I've studied French culture and French politics quite a bit, formerly being a French student, where the class mainly revolved around that subject. And so France has a different idea of secularism than what we do. Secularism to us is government having a neutral perspective on religion. It doesn't matter whether you're Christian or you're Jew or whatever, it doesn't matter. In France, it's a bit different. Their concept of secularism, laïque, is more, or laïcité, I believe. Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah,
laïcité.
I think that's it.
Thank you. Is different in the sense that government actively seeks out ways to make sure religion isn't part of society, basically. Like, that's an oversimplification, but they're a lot more aggressive in trying to make sure almost everything is secular, which is which makes odd bedfellows, because typically, again, we tend to have a better view, the two of us and people like us, on the government of France than say the government of the United States at times. But in this case, we're kind of in this awkward side where we might be agreeing with right-wingers here in the United States of, no, the French government shouldn't be doing that. That's encroaching on the freedom of religion. But again, in France, they tend to view it more as the freedom from religion rather than the freedom of religion. So at least for leftists in France, it might be more so we want as little religious symbols and indicators in public as possible. Whereas obviously right-wingers tend to be, we don't want Muslims. So
I'd be careful, Vex. From my reading of a lot of articles from France recently, it's that there's been a shift. If you just look at the rhetoric of some of France's left-wing politicians, even within their socialist party, it's not just we want less religion in society and this is a way to do it. It's actively, no, don't get us wrong. We also don't like Muslims. We also think they're a problem. So I think in France there is a danger of that, where there is neither side is actually defending the minorities' rights, or at least even trying. Like they're both like acting like, no, we're a little bit uncomfortable with them. And I think that has something to do with something you brought up earlier, which is that a lot of their immigrants end up in kind of low-income areas around the major cities. So then you never, it creates an other. And I think even to their left, that's something they've started to, especially with the terrorist attacks and the lack of a, how would I put it, I'm looking for the right word here. But there hasn't been a response on the left to these problems that I think has addressed the fears of the population. And because of that, it's allowed this creeping kind of xenophobia to begin to permeate even the more progressive elements of French society.
Yeah, well, and that tends to happen. And I definitely concede that point to you because especially in most of the terror attacks that we hear about in the Western world in the past year or so have mainly been in France. So the people of France have very, very legitimate grounds to stand on when they're worried about this kind of thing. Are they right? No. I don't think a burkini is going to run over a bunch of people in Nice. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But obviously that's not exactly what they're shooting for, but this kind of thing happens a lot. It happened in the United States after 9/11. Even, some of the most left-wing people, because they wanted to get reelected and because they didn't want to be painted by their opponents as sympathizing with the enemy, with the other. They came out strongly, almost racistly against Muslims and against Arabs, and those that didn't often ended up losing re-election. Max Cleland is a big example of that. He was a Vietnam War hero, He went into Congress, was a senator, didn't have, I believe, either he lost one of his legs or both of his legs. Fighting in Vietnam in another unjust war, and he spoke out against Iraq. He spoke out against the 9/11 Commission, and he lost re-election.
Yeah.
Now, those things don't necessarily completely correlate. Doesn't mean necessarily one completely led to the other, but there is an overlap there. Yeah. And so there's a lot to see. Same thing, part of the same thing with John Kerry. Even he was like, yeah, I voted for the war in Iraq, but let's not hate all Muslims. Mm-hmm. And George Bush kind of had the same tone, and it was a close election between the two because people were like, all right, but I want the guy who hates Muslims. Where's he?
Yeah. So, yeah. If there's any parting thought on that, it's certainly, I hope that the decisions made right now aren't regretted 10 years later in hindsight, because, I say this a lot, and people hate me when I say this, but nobody's special. Americans aren't special, and French people aren't special. You're going to act the same way. And I'm hoping that at least the French people have the benefit of being able to see what you guys did over the noughties and then realize later, oh, wait, maybe we shouldn't have passed the Patriot Act. And the other thing is, just a parting thought, it shows you that politicians, like regular people, quite often try to take the easy route. Because there is a way to address the problem. But that's hard. A burkini ban is not hard. So, and the problem is, I think a lot of people will be fine with that ban, even though it never would have addressed the problem. They would have viewed it as we did something, and you wouldn't have actually done anything, but it would make you feel good. So we got to make sure that when we try to pass these policies to address these problems, we actually sit down and think about what would actually have a long-term net benefit for us, and not simply what makes us feel good right now. Yeah.
I just have I
Yeah,
just have one
go
final
ahead.
thing to say on it, and then we'll go to another topic. Uh, oh. uh, I think in France, any country is susceptible to this, as Christian just said. But it's especially problematic in France, given, as we explained earlier, their view of laïcité, or secularism, where they view it as freedom from religion rather than freedom of religion. So it does make it particularly hard to battle it, at least, I guess, from a legal, constitutional, and cultural perspective with the French, because they're used to, despite it being overwhelmingly a Catholic nation, they are used to the government stepping in and saying no to almost any religious idolatry. So,
Yeah.
no matter how big or small it is. So, in that sense, I think it's a bit harder than, say, if it was in the U.S., because in the U.S. we have the history of freedom of religion. It doesn't matter what religion you are, you're allowed to practice and you're allowed to be whatever you are. So at least we have solid ground on that. But I'll end it on that.
Okay. So, sort of left it in a good place to move to the next thing I wanted to talk about. And this was something my, Madison, my conservative friend, brought up to me. And I just found it horrifying and hilarious and just hard to wrap my head around. But anyways, it's an article written by this guy named Joshua Seidel, and he's a Jewish Trump supporter and a self-proclaimed member of the alt-right.
Okay, hold on. Sorry, just hold on for a second. I have heard that term thrown around so much. I don't understand. What is it? What does it mean?
The alt-right?
Yeah.
So the alt-right, I would basically, in a word, describe as neo-fascists. They have fancier ways of describing it, although I think many of them would actually be completely fine with that comparison. But basically, that they are. They're a group of people who feel that the right wing is not. Basically, they're the group of like racist people and that kind of stuff. Where like, kind of like the right wing isn't doing what we need it to do. It's not addressing the real problems. So we got to go out there and like actually, give voice to the actual realities that, just black people just aren't as good as white people and you can't trust the Jews. Like, we just have to accept these are realities and not dance around the fact. That's kind of what the alt-right is.
And alt standing for like alternative?
Yes.
I'm guessing? Okay. Okay, yeah. But anyway, sorry about that. Just get on to the self-hating Jew.
Exactly. So that's basically what this guy is. It's this article where he's going on about how, I have a thick skin, so I can deal with all these people who hate me. And if you just talk to them, like, they say bad things about me, but, they're kind of, we agree on things, so I can get past it because I've got a thick skin. And I'm like, dude, why are you looking for, like, why are you trying to get these people to accept you? They clearly don't like you. It proves the very point. So that's, and they sort of, yeah, it's, Milo Yiannopoulos, that guy?
Yeah.
He's an example of someone who's in that movement.
Unfortunately, I know of him.
Yeah.
I kind of feel bad that people have to know like who he is and that he exists.
Yeah.
Like, that's just an unfortunate reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyways,
yeah. Sorry. Yeah, continue.
Yeah. See, it's just this article about this guy like trying to, at one point he tries to say how the alt-right isn't anti-Semitic because it's okay to hate Jewish people, but you just can't want legal action against them. I'm like, dude, that's not, that's something that strikes me about the whole thing. It's this lack of understanding that language informs culture and culture defines what's legal, right? Because we vote for what we want to be the law. And if you have a culture in which it is okay to say anti-Semitic things, people will be anti-Semitic and will pass laws that harm you, the Jewish guy, who's saying you're okay with this situation. So anyway, that's the alt-right.
I don't understand. There's this fixation on law by a lot of people who are politically ignorant, let's say.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a rude way. Like they're literally like they just don't understand politics that much, and that's fine. You don't
Mhm.
you don't have to be a smart person to know all about politics. But
Yeah.
and I find this issue on both the left and the right of people, for instance, saying, you can't discriminate against white people. Let's just throw that out there. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
you can. Like, it's very rare. Not a lot of people do it, especially in the United States, because there tend to be a lot more white people. But you can do that. Like, that's a thing that happens. People can do that. There's such thing as the Black Panther movement and the
Yeah.
black separatist and the black supremacist movement. While they're smaller and not really as significant, they're there. Same thing
Mhm.
with this genius over here, this guy who's like, oh well, if you're not for legal action against Jews, then you're not anti-Semitic. Since when did law enter this equation?
Yeah.
I just don't understand. Like, yeah, in the history books, discrimination has tended to have a basis in law.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that just because a law ends doesn't mean discrimination is over. And I find this to be an even bigger problem when it comes to talking actually about discrimination against black people in the United States. People assume because Jim Crow laws don't exist anymore, and of course the famous slavery ended 150 years ago bit, that there is no discrimination against black people are completely equal. Women got the right to vote back in the 1920s, they're completely equal. Since when did laws determine anything and everything? I thought you were the people who say that laws shouldn't determine anything and
Yeah.
everything. So that I just don't understand where that line of it's like here's their line of thinking, here's logic, and it's just
Yeah.
complete opposite directions.
And another thing he says in this article is he calls liberals hypocritical, kind of like playing identity politics. And he says that he's watched white become a slur in the media. And that's something I'm very like I don't understand what people mean when they're saying that, because okay, on one ground I can sort of understand half of that when people say, oh, liberals play identity politics. Like I understand why you're saying that, because we bring up how Pacific Islanders don't have easy access to healthcare if they're veterans, because the closest office is really far away from their island. Okay, but I'm pointing that out because that happens to be a case that specifically hurts Pacific Islanders. So it just so happens it's hurting them specifically. When I say, even the most like obvious example of the time is black people get shot by get arrested for drugs more, even though the usage rate is the same. I'm not telling you that the white people who are using the drugs are bad people. I'm okay with drugs being legalized. That's not my point. I think it's a misunderstanding of what the attempt is on the left when we bring up race and politics. And to the idea that somehow white has become a slur, when I say white privilege is a thing, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not blaming you, Matthew, for being white and saying it's your fault and you've done something wrong. I'm just pointing out Matthew is more likely to succeed than a black person in some impoverished neighborhood in New York. Like that's what I'm saying. I'm not trying to say Matthew's a bad guy, but I think there's this misunderstanding that when you say there's white privilege, you're saying Matthew's a bad guy.
Well, I think that problem really comes down to, if you will, the left's marketing. And I don't mean this in the sense of like elected officials and stuff like that. I just mean everyday people who identify as any sort of thing on the left. But first, I want to talk to the identity politics thing. This is actually where I kind of agree with some right wingers, in the sense that in the West Wing, one of my favorite shows, they do have a few Republicans in them in the show who are kind of token, if you will, the token woman and Ainsley Hayes, the token gay Republican, Matt Skinner, and on and on and on. And what those characters consistently say is that, you know, being gay or being a woman or being black or being whatever does not define me. It doesn't define me. I agree with, you know, the party on X amount of issues. You know, the vast majority of issues. They happen to not like who I am in terms of, you know, being having access to birth control or being able to marry the person that I love or what have you. But I agree with them on most other things. To which I probably say just join a different party. But the point is still valid. Is that a lot of the time Democratic politicians, leftist politicians, do play identity politics because they try to pander to those minority groups. I think again, I always talk about the difference between elected officials and the voters. There's a very big, stark difference. And unfortunately, people tend to assume both of those groups are the same when they're not.
Yeah.
I think most liberal voters, most leftist voters think, yeah, we need to be doing something about race problems in America because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But in terms of politicians, they tend to be more like, all right, well, this is how I get votes. You know, this is how I kind of rein in these groups and get them under my sort of tent. So let me appeal to them. But back on to sorry, that was a long segue, long tangent. But back on to the other point of the sort of marketing of what we're talking about, because it's sort of the Tumblr stereotype of, you know, someone saying, you know, your average Joe saying, you know, all lives matter, and then your sort of typical Tumblr person coming on and being like, oh, you're so privileged, you're so racist, blah, 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 blah. And that tends to be, now we're talking about leftist voters, leftist activists, people who aren't elected. Their marketing tends to be bad because it tends to be very reactionary. And I know that's a term that a lot of leftists don't try to associate themselves with, but it's the reality is that a lot of the time, whenever we see someone say anything that we have come to understand, justly so, is you know, has some sort of prejudice behind it or privilege behind it, we immediately jump to the labels. We immediately start pounding those people and saying you're a racist, you're sexist, you're ageist, you're classist, you have white privilege, you have male privilege, you have straight privilege, yada yada yada. Well, those concepts are important to keep in mind, and they are very real. Just throwing those words at people, especially if they don't know what those are or don't understand them, isn't going to help at all.
Yeah, you alienate a potential ally by doing that. Whereas if a calm explanation as to why maybe that wasn't the best way to word that thought might have been a better approach.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, I just don't understand, because yes, there are some people who are just straight up racist that will never, ever be revived, if you will, or redeemed. David Duke comes to mind, someone like that. But the point of discussing politics is not to spat at each other. Leave that to the politicians. You can actually change someone's mind when it's an average person talking to an average person. And you don't change minds by name calling and by being aggressive.
Yeah. It actually reminds me, it was an article I forgot to put up here, and I'm not going to discuss the whole article, but it's an interesting tie into this. It was about a Asian guy. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but the article, I'm saying he's Asian because it's important to the article that he wrote. but he was an intern for a newspaper this summer, and he was sent to cover a shooting, I think in Missouri or something like that, of a black teen, of two black teens, or one, I believe. Anyway, so he was there. He was covering the protests, and he's a self-proclaimed Black Lives Matter member, like supporter. And anyways, they're at the protest, and he's with his white friend who's also part of the internship. He's taking pictures while he's writing. And then a group of black guys chase them down and start beating them up, saying that they don't belong here. You're just shouting at them, beating them up. And then ultimately, he is saved, but not his white friend, when another group says, yo, he's Asian, lay off. His white friend still is in trouble, and he ultimately manages to get away, but nonetheless, it happened. I think that's a very literal example of what the problem is that, look, you can't, that's problematic. It's when you start actually going after these people, saying they're the other, and you're playing the same game that you're complaining about the police doing to you. When you start going after other groups, even if it's, like, that's just as bad. It's just as bad. You can't do that either. So yeah, what you said about the whole don't be reactionary is right, and also don't make other groups an other while you're trying to say how terrible things are for you, because you never know. There's probably a lot of people of that other ethnicity or race who agree with you. It shouldn't matter. So anyway, I think that's both two very important things. Either way, this Jewish guy is wrong. This is just a naive or uneducated guy who doesn't understand the trains of thought he's bashing. And I think that for the alt-right at large is true. I have talked to members of the alt-right who I personally know personally know. And it's the same thing. You just quickly realize these guys have no idea. They have no grounds to discuss what they're talking about, but they feel from watching, their Amazing Atheist or their, what's the other guy there?
I don't know. I stopped paying attention.
Sargon of Akkad characters, like that kind of thing. They feel so smart because Sargon of Akkad will dress up with racism in such flowery language that you yourself now feel smart for agreeing with them.
And he realizes that, and he's just like, religion's bad, man. Everything's a lie.
Yeah, they got no grounds to talk. Like, the moment even someone with like a minor little understanding of the issues steps into the room, they're just, oh, Sita, what is this? That's what happens. It's hilarious. Every story kind of blends together this episode. But the last one I did want to bring up, and I'm sure you've heard of it, either the viewer or Matt yourself. Kaepernick? That sounds right.
I don't know. I don't follow football, and I butcher names anyway, so
yeah.
You can go with that.
Basically, he's a member of the San Francisco 49ers, and he didn't stand up for the national anthem. And he was basically like, yo, I'm not going to stand for the flag when the flag's not upholding the values I'm supposed to be standing for and respecting. And then the world exploded because he wasn't allowed to do that, and he wasn't he wasn't respecting the veterans who died for that flag. People were burning his jersey. Yeah, I found that really weird. No, I didn't find it weird. I found it completely predictable. I respect him for having the guts to do that. I will say that. It's different here, and I think as you move away from the U.S., it becomes increasingly different. Where like here, if you didn't here, you do the national anthem thing through like elementary school and high school, and then that's it. And by the time you're in high school, you're not even singing the song anymore. You're standing there like, when can I sit down? I don't care. So yeah, I think there's might be some cultural divide here in terms of how incredibly outrageous this is. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting to discuss perhaps the impact politics can sports can have on politics, because it certainly brings this issue to a stage forward to people who wouldn't have otherwise even thought about it. Because he's a black player, of course, saying that he feels that black people aren't being treated fairly in the States, hence he will not stand for the flag right now. So I think it's interesting, because that brought it forward to a stage the issue would have never otherwise not been on. Yeah,
well,
worth bringing that up.
It's always interesting when people in sort of, I guess, sports and I guess you could say popular media do something like this, such as the two guys during the 1968 Olympics, Mexico City Olympics, with the sort of Black Power fist raised, as well as Muhammad Ali doing something similar.
Random story about that. There's an Australian guy who was third on the podium when the Americans did that. And who's sort of always viewed as kind of racist for not joining in, but he actually said he talked to the guys before when they did it, and they requested that he doesn't, because it's not his fight, because he's Australian.
Yeah.
So he decided to, yeah. So he was like, I wasn't trying to be, I was just doing what they told me. I wasn't trying to be mean. Found interesting. Anyways, go ahead.
But yeah, I remember that story. So like a few months ago. But so now I myself have mixed feelings about this. In terms of people's reaction to it, I think most of them are completely unwarranted. Like burning his jersey, I'm like, how much more childish can you get?
Yeah.
And also, of course, there's the incredible irony I hear from a lot of people, regardless of their political affiliation, but if they don't like Black Lives Matter, or if they don't think police brutality or any of this is an actual problem, they say, well, they need to stop rioting. They need to stop being violent. Well, this guy didn't do anything violent. He did something completely peaceful, and people are still outraged. So that's a bit of a double standard right there. Now, it's a bit different because, in a sense, it is disrespecting the flag. And for me, as someone who has a family that is very entrenched in military service, in public service to the United States, it's a bit more of a shake your ground for me. Because I know myself, anytime there's the national anthem, I always stand up for it. I think it's kind of odd that it's done so much. I think it's a little unnecessary how much it's done. But it really goes back to the Cold War, really, when and World War, and really all the way back to World War I, when we were infused with this mass patriotism, this grand patriotism that you have to be proud of your country and you have to defend this country to the last, ever since you were a small child. And obviously, a lot of the people who are acting in such a negative way are from those generations of people who still lived during that era of acceptable ultranationalism, if you will, or exceptional extreme patriotism. And that kind of still persists, and that's a big reason why a lot of the time those kind of people will not accept flaws within this country that are brought up by younger people and by people on the left. They're more than happy to bring it up when Donald Trump is saying that America isn't great anymore for some odd reason. But when it comes to actual problems, they're very much against it. So my personal thing is, if I were him, I wouldn't have done it. But that is me coming in with my perspective, my personality, my race, for one thing. I would have stood up. That being said, him being such a big figure, especially being a really non-controversial figure, and also being a big figure not only now on the political scene, but in really the culture overall, I think is really important because for the past 2 years, this discussion has really been sort of stuck in the political realm. Those celebrities that have been talking about it are usually political anyway, so it doesn't make much of a difference. And this goes for a lot of other things too. George Clooney is arrested almost every year protesting climate change. No one gives a crap because that's what he does all the time.
Yeah, that's his shtick.
But when it gets to the point that someone who usually has no involvement with this whatsoever takes part in it, that's when eyes open. That's when people turn their heads. That's when this becomes a bigger conversation than it is. So again, I'm glad that he started this conversation and that he made it bigger. If I were him, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah. I do want to leave it on an interesting tweet, though, I read when I was just sort of following it loosely. When someone said, there's a problem when people are more outraged about him not standing for the flag than they are about the actual problem he's not standing for.
Mm-hmm.
I found that to be a very interesting and powerful thought. Regardless of whether or not you think he should have stood for the flag, that's a very interesting thought.
Well, I think that was the point. Part of the point of why he did it is to show that people are going to be like that, and that's unfortunately the kind of culture that we live in, where things that shouldn't be outraged over are, and things that should be outraged over aren't because they're uncomfortable. Yeah. Almost anybody can get behind standing in front of that flag, putting your hand over your heart, and listening attentively to the Star Spangled Banner. Almost anybody can get behind that.
Yeah.
A lot fewer people can get behind, hey, there's inherent racism in this country. Yeah. Whether you know it or not, you're racist. That one is a lot more difficult to accept than the other.
Yeah. So anyway, that's everything I had for the night. So unless you got something else,
All right. Well, so to continue this race topic, I guess.
Oh boy, it's been the whole episode.
Governor Paul LePage, I don't know. I don't give a shit. He's a shitty guy, so I don't care if I slaughter his name. Maine, yeah, governor of Maine. And was somehow reelected. I don't know how. I don't know.
Chosen by God, Matthew.
I really just, he's such a bad guy. He's basically the Donald Trump of Maine.
Can I pause for a second and rant about Maine, just briefly?
Go ahead.
So when I was driving back from Boston after I met up with you, it was raining horribly. And raining horribly through the end of Massachusetts into Vermont was fine. I mean, through Massachusetts was fine, because Massachusetts highways are like this. So rain washes off the highway. In Maine, they are flat. Maine highways are flat. So it's just puddling, and you cannot... Why, Maine? Why would you do that, Maine? That's a stupid idea. It snows in Maine, I'm sure, so it must be really bad in the winter. I don't know what they're doing.
No, Christian, the real problem is that too many immigrants are coming into Maine. So this is where the story begins. Paul LePage, infamous Donald Trump of Maine and racist galore, basically said that we have to take action. We have to start shooting at the enemy being black people. Like, that's not exactly what he said, but it was pretty damn close. It was more along the lines of the people coming over the border. So, again, not that... I don't know why he cares. He's not running for president. He's not running for anything bigger. He's probably going to retire after this term he's in. That's probably going to be the end of his political career, unless Donald Trump gets elected and appoints him to something. He stands no chance of winning as U.S. Senator from Maine or Congressman. So I don't know. I don't know why he's concerned so much about this. Maine, I don't know if you've noticed, is probably the state that's farthest away from the Mexican border, besides on the mainland, besides Alaska and Hawaii.
Yeah.
So I just, it's so, he's your grumpy uncle.
Yeah.
He's your grumpy, racist, conservative uncle who gets drunk at Thanksgiving and starts dropping the N-word. Except Paul LePage isn't drunk, he's sober. That's the problem, is that he's sober the entire time.
Yeah.
He's not even trying to
Well,
cover it up.
Maybe he's been drunk his entire time as governor. And he's
He
going to
just
stop
wakes
being...
up and just takes a shot, and he's like, all right, let's go.
And one day he's going to run out, after he's done being governor, it might be 5 years from now, he's going to run out of alcohol, and he's going to sit in his car and be like, oh my God, what have I done? What have I...
He's going to sober up and realize how much of a horrible person he's been.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, the problem here is, I'm just going to say this before you get to your 2 cents real quick. The problem here isn't that he said something like this. That's to be expected from Paul LePage. The problem is that there are people defending him. Because, again, I often talk about the divide between elected officials and the people who vote for them, and the voters overall.
Yeah.
There is no disconnect, unfortunately. There's very little disconnect in this. They are basically on the same plane, pretty much. And they are proud to be on the same plane. This guy literally is trying to start a race war. Literally. Not that that can do much damage in Maine. There's about 1 black person in Maine. And he's probably a temporary
kind of half Latino, half white guy.
Yeah.
He's there.
And he can probably pass as white, so really not that much of a concern. But still, that's the thing. There are people who agree with him. And he is a fervent supporter of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has said very similar things and almost come to saying the exact same thing. So it doesn't disturb me that he has these opinions. It disturbs because, stuff like this can happen. And then people will, there will be backlash. He'll have to resign and all this stuff. In this, it's just, no, his approval ratings probably shot through the roof. And it's like, why the hell did that happen? But you go to your, you offer your 2 cents.
I think what we're starting to see happen a little bit, but I think the Tea Party kind of coming to the forefront around 2012 has a lot to do, is a perfect example of this. Where you had the right create this very toxic media culture, where this was acceptable. But what wasn't expected was that 40 years later, some of these people are going to start getting elected who honestly believed what this toxic media culture was saying. And an interesting thing, I remember Sam Cedar had a clip up from a right-wing talk show host who's against Trump, who was kind of saying he's sorry because he believes he's somewhat responsible for creating Trump. And Sam Cedar said, yeah, you're damn right you are. Because not only have you done that, but you've also trained this part of the population to immediately denounce and reject anyone who has an inconvenient thought about what you just said or what you believe. And I think Paul LePage is an example of one of these people who honestly believes in that right-wing media culture. His is in a state where a lot of people probably subscribe to it. And they're all trained to reject any voice that denounces them. And it sort of becomes like a frenzy where you agree with him, he agrees. It's like this show sometimes. I agree with you, you agree with me, then we believe in the idea more. Then it becomes reinforced and strengthened over time to the point where it's almost gospel. And then if someone came in here with an outside, I think it's even more so in Maine than here, because I think, let's be honest, we're not the same. As those people, at some level, I think we're a little bit better versed in the issues, but it reaches a point where any outside idea becomes ridiculous on face value. And I think there's an example of that where it's so obvious that Latino immigrants are the problem, that someone comes up here and says, hey, I've literally Enrique down the street who just moved in for a temporary job out of, New York. He's literally the only Latino guy here. How could Enrique be the problem? They're like that's what it is. It's like it's that kind of situation. I think that's that, and I just don't think he liked the particular person he was writing about, and he was probably drunk and angry and just wrote a very angry letter, and maybe that's part of it. And he's just kind of happy that people are defending him. Because maybe we're talking about different things, but I think he left like a voicemail at some point. Maybe this is something different. But he did that as well. He left a voicemail for a member of the state Congress, or whatever you call the state legislature in Maine. And it was also pretty racist. It was quite funny. He called him I can't remember what he called him in the voicemail. It's funny. I should find it.
I think I remember. I want to say he called him coon, but I might be wrong. I want to say it was like pretty explicit. Like,
yeah.
But again, don't quote me. Don't quote me. I could be completely wrong. But
yeah.
it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for Paula.
Basically, Paula Page does such crazy stuff so often that it all kind of blurs together into one event.
Pretty much.
What did you say this week? I don't know. I assume it was something like last week.
Something racist.
Yeah. Anyway.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. Again, as I said at the beginning of the show, Christian will not be here this coming Sunday, so we will not be having a show this coming Sunday. We will be having a show, let's see, if I can get up my calendar. So Sunday, September 11th will be our next show. And imagine that we'll probably be talking a lot about the 15th anniversary of 9/11, since that's the day, possibly. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we hope to see you not this Sunday, but the next Sunday, September 11th, 2016. And as always, remember, have malice toward none.
Adios.